Okay, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Good evening, maybe for some of you joining us today for this webinar. We'll start slowly as people are gathering now. So my name is Hugues Roussy. I'm working at ETF, the European Training Foundation, where I head the Human Capital Development Intelligence Unit. Welcome to this webinar on the impact of USAID withdrawal on global education and skills development worldwide that we co-organize with the International Education Donor Group, whose executive director, Laura Savage, is with us today and will speak later. For those who might be a little bit less familiar with ETF, just let me say a few words. We are the European Union agency supporting human capital development in the European neighborhood. So our work focuses on strengthening education, training, but also employment systems to help our partner countries build more inclusive learning and training, skilling, upskilling, reskilling environment to support their economy. And we work in all the European neighborhood regions, such as the Western Balkan, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Southern, Eastern, Western Mediterranean countries. So our discussion today is rooted in a major event that we all witnessed recently, a shift in the global education landscape, the withdrawal of USAID from its education, training, international commitment. So USAID, you know, that has historically played an important role in financing, but also shaping education and skills development at international level, and especially, but not only, in low-income countries and in countries with fragility or crisis-sensitive country. So when this withdrawal was confirmed at ETF, we commissioned a report because we wanted to better understand what it would change in our work and how it would affect our activities and how we operate, not only with our partner countries, but all the partners in those countries. So we needed to have a little bit of an assessment where funding gaps might exist, but also to examine the potential direct and indirect consequences for our programs on how the shift might affect our ongoing activities, which are collaborative activities in some cases, in particular where USAID was very present, but also the side effect and disruptions that might arrive for ETF and EU-led activities for the broader human capital ecosystem, how we contribute to it in this ecosystem, and how the geometry has changed. And also, I think for us, but also the EU and all of us, how these withdrawal affects the wider international education and skills agenda at a time when I believe there's a need for more collaboration. So these are not only questions of funding, though it is very important, but also strategic implications, alignment, harmonization, as we used to say, collaboration, and the need for the continuous coordination that we all believe is important. So today we present the finding of this report, and I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Elena Walls, who authored this study for ETF. So Elena is, of course, some of you know her, exceptionally well placed to guide us through this shift. She served as Senior Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning Advisor at USAID Center for Education for years before becoming the agency's research policy team lead. Elena holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Maryland. And along her career, she contributed to shaping evidence-based education strategies in various contexts, regions, and countries. Following Elena's presentation of her report, Dr. Bidemi Carol from the International Education Funders Group will share her reflection on the broader implication for the donor community. So Dr. Bidani is a senior education research analyst, independent consultant, and has long contributed through a career in policy reforms and research in education in African countries and beyond African countries. After this presentation, Lara Savage will lead us through the Q&A session. Hopefully, we'll have enough time to get your thoughts, questions, and contribution. Just to finish with, I'd like to say that as a whole community working on global education at different levels, some of us are donors, experts, implementers, partners in these fields. I think we've all been affected by this shift and this withdrawal. So today we saw that with Lara as an opportunity to begin a collective conversation on how to respond and how to continue support the systems, but also the people behind the systems who depend on our cooperation, our collaboration, and our commitment in the EU, ETF, and all of you in global education, human capital, and skills development. So thank you again for taking time today, being part of this dialogue. And I'll now hand it over to you, Elena, to walk us through the finding. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Hugues. Let me pull up my screen now for the presentation. Share. Can you see my screen? Wonderful. So before we begin, let us first take a quick look at the agenda. So as Hugues already mentioned, after my presentation, Bidemi will make a few remarks, followed by a discussion moderated by Lara Savage. Okay. So, sorry, just minimize this. Before I dive into the findings, let me start by telling you briefly about the study. So Hugues already mentioned it was funded by ETF. The objective of the study was to assess the implications of the cancellation of USAID funding on education and skills development worldwide. I used desk research and a secondary data analysis of publicly available data as the methodological approach. Unfortunately, most USAID-specific publicly available data sources had already been removed from the internet by the time of the study, which was March of this year. So I was limited in what I could access. Another important limitation is access to sector and subsector level impact data, particularly on the impact of programs funded and implemented across sectors. And finally, the study was limited to desk research, and therefore I could not verify information and data obtained from the internet through primary data sources. Okay, before I dive into findings, let's take a brief look at USAID. USAID was established in 1961 with the goal to support US foreign policy objectives as set by the Department of State. Over the years, USAID evolved into the largest bilateral provider of official development assistance, or ODA. In 2023, like it's shown on the slide, the agency operated in over 200 countries and had a budget of about $80 billion a year, which was about 0.07% of the US national budget. USAID's work came to a halt on January 20th of this year when the Trump administration took office. On the day of the inauguration, the president issued an executive order to pause all foreign assistance, initially for just 90 days. But within weeks, the administration canceled between 83, which was official initial count, 83%, and the final count seems to be more like 95% of all USAID programs, and initiated a process of integration of the remaining USAID programs with the Department of State. According to the leaked plans of the current administration that circulated on the internet, USAID, as we know it, will no longer exist, and only a small number of life-saving programs might continue under the Department of State. As USAID staff, all USAID staff have already been laid off or received termination letters with delay of date in the next few months. US embassies have been ordered to shut down USAID missions. In this presentation, I will share information on what the USAID education portfolio looked like before all of this happened, summarize documented impacts of its work, and offer recommendations for the global education community on mitigating the negative impacts of USAID fund withdrawal. Let's start with a look at the sectoral distribution of USAID's work. As this slide demonstrates, economic development, peace and security, health, and humanitarian assistance dominated USAID's work, comprising almost 90% of all USAID spending. Education spending accounted for less than 2% of the US ODA in recent years. Despite being relatively small on the total USAID budget, US education funding was an important contribution towards supporting global education initiatives alongside other Development Assistance Committee members. The US contributions ranged between 11 and 16% of total education ODA in the past 10 years. The US education investments also contributed toward achieving Sustainable Development Goal 4, which aims to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Since 2010, the US has contributed an average of 7% of total funding, making it the largest single country contributor. By comparison, EU countries combined contributed 37%. Non-EU countries contributed 22%, and development banks contributed 21%. Data on this slide also show the geographic distribution of SDG 4 focus spending. Historically, countries in sub-Saharan Africa have been the largest recipient of ODA investments, both from the US and cumulatively from other donors. In 2023, USAID managed nearly 2/3 of all US government appropriations for international education development. The role of other US agencies has varied over the years, depending on which challenges were the most prevalent. Over the past 15 years, funding allocations managed by USAID have targeted 3 main thematic areas in education: primary education, vocational training and workforce development, and higher education. In recent years, USAID managed about $1 billion a year in education funding, 3/4 of which were targeting basic education. The allocations to the international education sector have been congressionally authorized through dedicated legislation, which directed USAID to work with partner countries to strengthen their education systems and improve learning and educational outcomes across the education continuum. Now, let's unpack how USAID operated. In managing congressionally appropriated funds, USAID followed its 2018 education policy and 2024 education strategy, which reflected the mandates of relevant US laws. USAID programs followed the key principles of locally led development and country ownership, data-driven decision-making, focus on strengthening the capacity and measurable improvements in the performance of national education systems, and a strong emphasis on equity and inclusion. USAID operated mostly via its local and international partners, such as NGOs, for-profit companies, and academia. Only 11% of funding in recent years were transferred directly to partner governments. About 20% of annual USAID education funding was used to support the Global Partnership for Education and the Education Cannot Wait multilateral initiatives. The US government supported GPE and ECW since their inception, providing about 9% of their overall funding. Most of this funding has been channeled through USAID appropriations. USAID has also been an active member of the Secretariat in both initiatives, supporting coordination through convening power and providing technical assistance. Not noted on the slide, but mentioned in the report, is support from USAID for other multilateral initiatives in education, such as the Coalition for Foundational Learning and the Building Evidence for Education Donor Working Group. Looking at the geographic footprint of USAID operations, the largest investments in the education sector in recent years have been in the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. This reflects both US strategic priorities and regional needs. The third largest category of USAID education investments is the one that benefits the whole world. For example, multilateral initiatives like GP and ECW, research programs that benefit the entire portfolio, or training and knowledge management programs that support USAID missions across different geographies. Now, this slide shows 25 countries with the largest cumulative allocations for education programs over the past 3 years. Jordan received the highest amount of USAID education funding, nearly half of which was a direct transfer to the government of Jordan. The other two highest education assistance recipients were Egypt and Lebanon. The US government has significant interest in these 3 countries, which are centered around regional stability, counterterrorism, and the promotion of democratic governance in the Middle East. Other top education funding recipients included Afghanistan, Malawi, Kenya, DRC, Philippines, Senegal, and Liberia. The report provides some details for the top funded programs in basic education, workforce development, and higher education that were terminated in February of this year. Now let's examine the funding allocations at the subsectoral level. Over the past 15 years, the bulk of USAID education funding has been devoted to improving primary education systems in USAID partner countries. This slide shows the distribution of USAID education funding and the proportion of funded programs across subsectors using the most recent complete data from 2023. That year, USAID allocated most of education sector funding to primary education, which received 75% of the total funding and accounted for 58% of all USAID-funded education programs. Higher education followed at 17% of funding, going to 27% of programs. This distribution of funding highlights USAID's prioritization of primary education, while also addressing broader education needs across various subsectors. Additionally, I wanted to note that many USAID programs address multiple objectives and can meet criteria for inclusion under different categories. For example, many youth programs provide primary education, basic life skills, and vocational training to their participants, while also working with the government to strengthen existing vocational training systems. The overall data pattern indicates that primary education programs had significantly larger funding compared to higher education or other types of programs. USAID's education programs in different subsectors reflect regional needs. For example, primary education programs are concentrated mostly in Africa and Asia, while a lot of higher education and workforce development programs are found in the Middle East, Central Asia, and Latin America. Now let's turn to the summary of impacts achieved by USAID education programs. The impact of USAID withdrawal will be most profoundly felt in the basic education space, where USAID concentrated a lot of its work over the past 15 years. Systematic reviews of USAID-funded basic education programs found that they made measurable improvements in foundational skills for millions of primary grade learners. Reviews also found that these programs were becoming more impactful and more cost-effective with time as USAID promoted reforms took effect. Less quantifiable, but perhaps more impactful in the long term, was USAID leadership in global advocacy for improving foundational skills. USAID invested in the generation of comparable data on learning outcomes to demonstrate severe gaps in foundational skills. This data helped make the case for education reforms with partner governments and local and international stakeholders. Another important area of USAID investments was to build out an evidence base for effective approaches to literacy instruction and acquisition, such as structured pedagogy and teaching at the right level, and promote their use. USAID's withdrawal from partner countries will likely create not only a funding gap, but also an advocacy and expertise gap, specifically in the area of foundational skills and in the attention to the marginalized and vulnerable learners. The sudden withdrawal of resources is likely to lead to the discontinuation of teacher training programs and the suspension of initiatives aimed at improving early literacy and numeracy skills. This disruption will disproportionately affect vulnerable populations, exacerbating existing inequalities in access to education. Additionally, The loss of the funding for multilateral initiatives, GPP and ECW, will create a resource gap in their budgets. There is also a risk that USAID's withdrawal will discourage other donors from contributing, impacting the ability of these initiatives to fulfill their mandate. In the long term, the loss of USAID's funding, leadership, and
la
expertise
perte de ce financement et de leadership va complètement mettre de côté tous les efforts investis jusqu'à présent. En plus de son rôle de leadership et amélioration de l'éducation, les compétences qui ont été créées
USAID has funded numerous vocational and skills training programs in its partner countries to reduce poverty and to promote economic growth. These programs were designed to meet the needs of the context and commonly aimed at achieving a wide array of outcomes. The impact of USAID-funded youth workforce development programs included improved employment rates and livelihoods, high earnings, and enhanced skills and employability of graduates. Similar to basic education, many workforce development programs had a strong equity dimension, ensuring gender empowerment and support for young people with disabilities. The withdrawal of USAID funding will likely lead to increased unemployment rates among young people and the decline in skilled labor pipeline, which will disproportionately affect marginalized groups such as disadvantaged youth, women, and refugees. Last but not least, USAID has had a long history of funding higher education programs. A common element of these programs was a focus on improving the capacity and performance of higher education institutions to serve as a central actor in the country's development process. The specific impacts of these investments varied depending on the country's context and the sectoral focus of the program. Some programs provided pathways to higher education for underserved students, while other programs focused on improving the alignment between higher education provision and employers' needs. The loss of USAID funding will impact the ability of higher education institutions to keep up with rapidly evolving private sector. Finally, the research and innovation ecosystems have been particularly hard hit by USAID's withdrawal, with long-term consequences for national development. Many USAID-funded research hubs were critical for solving local challenges through applied research. Their cancellation and USAID's withdrawal will have a long-lasting negative impact on the local economies. To sum up, USAID provided a significant amount of resources to the global education sector, in particular in countries and areas affected by crises and conflicts. The loss of these resources will have immediate and profound negative impacts on children, youth, and their communities. Because of USAID's focus on the most vulnerable and marginalized populations, they are the ones that will be affected the most: refugees, children and youth with disabilities, ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities, children and youth living in poverty, and girls and young women will be disproportionately affected by USAID's withdrawal. These impacts will be felt not just in financial terms. Through its convening authority, USAID country staff worked with other donors to coordinate resource allocation around long-term education objectives outlined in countries' education sector plans, and also worked to attract additional funding for education. USAID's convening power and brokering authority led many countries to adopt ambitious education goals and increase their own funding to priority areas. Donors and the partner government coordinated the implementation of these plans, ensuring all key elements were funded and the progress was tracked. The loss of USAID leadership at the country level will have a ripple effect on ESP implementation and learning outcomes. These losses will likely lead to the erosion of progress made toward achieving global education goals. The negative impacts will be acutely felt in fragile countries where education provision is particularly dependent on donor support, such as Lebanon, Afghanistan, and Malawi. Okay, sorry. Trying to click the next slide. Okay. As of today, all of USAID education programs have been terminated, and there are no plans to resume any education-related work previously implemented by USAID. The report concludes with a series of recommendations for the global education donor community. Given the funding and technical leadership gap left by the withdrawal of USAID, the first recommendation is to improve coordination to optimize efficiency of resource allocation. Another recommendation is to diversify donor base by engaging with the private sector and exploring innovative funding solutions, such as impact bonds or results-based financing. At this time of shrinking resources, the cost effectiveness of solutions becomes particularly important. One of the report's recommendations is to increase investments in strengthening the evidence base to support education reforms, ensuring that solutions address the root causes of local education issues, and that only proven solutions are scaled. To finish up, while the dismantling of USAID presents a significant challenge to the global education sector, it also offers an opportunity for stakeholders to innovate and to strengthen their collaboration. By adopting these strategic responses, donors, governments, international organizations, and local actors can ensure that progress toward SDG 4 continues, even in the face of reduced funding. This collective effort will be critical to safeguarding the right to education for millions of children and youth worldwide. Thank you very much. And now over to Bidemi for her remarks.
Thank you, Elena. I will just start my presentation. Can you just confirm that you can see the PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good day, everybody, wherever you are. My name is Bidemi Carroll. I have been working with Laura and the team at IEFG to assess the impact of the foreign aid reductions on the education sector, as a way to first understand who's doing what and what information there is out there, and then also to have that inform further research work that we might want to do. I want to thank Elena and the ETF for their very comprehensive report focusing on USAID's the implications of the USAID withdrawal on the education sector. I think this is sort of the first major sector-specific report that we've seen. And I know, given where things are, it must have taken a lot of work to put all of this together. So what I'm going to do in my time with you is to share a quick synthesis of who else is studying the aid cuts, what they're finding, and where we still have blind spots and opportunities to do more research. So in addition to USAID's withdrawal from the aid sector, I think when it first happened, we all thought, well, maybe other donors would come in to fill in some of the gaps. But what we've seen actually is that other major donors, especially the European donors, have also been making announcements about reductions in foreign aid. Belgium, France, Germany, the Netherlands, the UK, etc. And by all accounts, we may see more cuts from other countries as well. There is still quite a bit of uncertainty and unpredictability within this space in terms of, for the US, we know based on the presentation that all education funding has been cut. For the other donors, we're not exactly sure yet what the implications are for the education sector. But all of this means that there is a potential opportunity for philanthropy and non-traditional donors, and also for governments themselves to think differently about how we fund education, what we prioritize, and how to make sure the funding is being used in the most sort of um, efficient way. So just to give a sense of who else is out there studying the impact of the foreign aid cuts. This slide shows that there are quite a few players involved in thinking about this. Um, we have think tanks like the Center for Global Development and some universities who are studying the implications. Many of these are also looking at the USAID impact because that's where we have a bit more information, and that's been sort of the most immediately implemented. We also see network organizations like the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, Civicus, which is a network of civil society organizations, ICVA, etc., who have been doing surveys, surveying their member organizations to understand how the funding changes are affecting their operations on the ground. We know multilaterals like the World Bank, UNESCO GEM report are also currently working on looking at the global education financing more generally. Some philanthropy organizations like Gates and the Prevail Fund are also, are also looking at their countries of interest to see how the impact has been on the ground. And I know there was also a meeting last month that brought together ministers and from about 20 African countries discussing the implications for foundational learning. DevEx, which is a media organization, has also been putting out quite a bit of analysis and providing updated news about the cuts from the various donors. And Seek Development has a budget cuts tracker on the internet where it's keeping track of all the announcements that are coming out. So there's a range of organizations that are looking at this. The challenging thing is that the context is still very dynamic and things are changing day by day. In terms of what they're doing, we've seen the network organizations putting out members surveys. There are a few online surveys that are out there and still active and still collecting data from their member organizations. We also see analysis of the aid data. Elena has just presented one focused on USAID and the education data. There are others, the GEM report, that are looking more generally, not specifically to education, but how analyzing and forecasting what the reductions in these aid mean for various sectors. We are expecting a few country studies forthcoming from some foundations. And then I think one thing to say is that there's very few at this point sector-focused data, especially in education. There are some analyses that have been done in health and nutrition and what this means for and HIV/AIDS, but we're only now seeing with the ETF one a more education-specific analysis. So the findings from all of these studies are pretty preliminary because, as I said, many studies are ongoing and the situation is dynamic. Almost all are really focused on the USAID cuts because they are the most dynamic. As Elena mentioned, all of the USAID basic education programs have been cut, and countries that are most affected are, the poorest, conflict-affected countries that USAID uh, gave a lot of support to. We also, from the survey, the member surveys of the organizations, we know that local national NGOs have been hit really hard by all of this. Um, the survey from Civica showed that these organizations, most of them really only had about a month of financial resources to operate once that stop work order hit. And many have had to let go of staff, and um, some have even closed down. So the local organizations, I think, trying to understand what this means for them would be really important. I think also some of the surveys highlight this erosion of trust. Basically, as long-standing commitments were just abruptly abandoned, and people weren't really sure what was going on, and many of them were left to sort of manage the fallout of these with very little notice. So I think there's definitely been a lack of transparency as well about, kind of in the beginning, why the stop work orders and how the decisions were made, and all of those kinds of things. As Elena mentioned, vulnerable populations face the most risk. Save the Children reported that they had to, they had to close schools in refugee camps, which meant like a lot of the children, basically had nowhere to go for schooling. So those refugee populations, children, asylum seekers, are definitely the most hit. We also see organizations report undertaking several mitigation strategies, trying to diversify their funding, trying to optimize cost, prioritize the work that they do. But this has, it has been difficult because, as I said, the overall picture is one of uncertainty, uneven impact, and also sort of a growing need for better information, especially for local organization, as to where they can look to support for some of the work that they've been doing. In terms of where the gaps are, um, with all these studies, we're still missing quite major information. First, there's a lack of education-specific impact stories, and especially country-level impact studies. We also see, many underrepresented voices of local actors, local organizations, um, trying to understand what this means for them. I think I mentioned that there was a foundational learning meeting where governments came together and recommitted to supporting foundational learning. But the voices haven't been very public and out there. We also hear that there has been some response by organizations to try to step in and help, but we don't really have a good grasp of, you know, mapping that response from other sort of philanthropic donors. And I think what would be really useful is to have sort of a unified synthesis to help guide the responses from others who would want to help. Why this matters for philanthropy, I think when you look at what local organizations are wanting to do, many of them are looking to diversify funds, looking for non-government funders of educate who can step in to support their education work. And I think there's an opportunity there for philanthropy and other non-traditional funders as well to step in as a catalyst and try to work to fill the gaps that are there. There are opportunities to help coordinate and also to lead. So there's an opportunity in this space more generally to help think through and with organizations and communities about how to use additional sources of funds to help achieve their goals. Work that we're doing in terms of understanding the implications is really, as I mentioned just in the beginning phases. We are also sort of asking you if you know of others who are doing this work to please let us know. But eventually, what we want to do is have a consolidated report on the existing aid cut analysis that are going on, specifically focused on the education sector. IEFG also wants to develop a research plan in order to help sort of fill the evidence gap so that we have a better understanding of the implications on the ground for countries, for local organizations, and for students and teachers and communities as well. Eventually, we want to provide some snapshot reports summarizing the evolving education landscape, and also to provide actionable recommendations for philanthropy and others who are trying to understand how the education landscape is shifting. So with that, I want to say thank you, and I'll hand it over to Laura for further reflections. Thank you.
Thanks, Bidemi. Really, my job now is to open up to all of you to give your responses and ask questions. I think the kind of three big messages that have come out through all of the conversation I've had with some of you on the line, but also with Hugues and Elena and Bidemi is, number one, let's join up the analysis. There is analysis going on of education out there, of the impact and implications of education cuts out there. Let's join it up. The more we know, the more we can strategically do together. There's a lot we don't know, and I think some of those questions, it would be really, really useful to hear today whether any of you are working on some of those questions. You know, we don't know, for example, the cascade layers of organizations that have been affected. The USAID websites have sort of first and second tier delivery chains, but not necessarily all the way through. We know some insights of changing conversations or ongoing conversations at either local organizational ministry level. We don't know yet any learning loss data. Is anyone already starting to think about that? Similar to the sort of COVID analysis that happened pretty quickly. So there's a lot of questions we don't know. The more we work together, the more we share, the more we get that message out there as to how we pull it together in an ongoing way, I think the better. And that's what we're at least offering our sort of role and leaning in to try and do together. I think the second message that comes out in a lot of these conversations is that the case for education and the case for investing in education has been made really well, but has not necessarily landed. And there's a bit of a question mark always in terms of why. And I think some of the big sort of non-education messaging over the last couple of months, including in some of the, you know, the kind of the FT and the Economist stuff that non-education people read and listen to, is that education was just one of those sectors that is swept under the carpet in terms of, you know, effectiveness. It's not as provable as some of the work in other sectors. And so how do we move forward and sort of look ahead to continuing to make that case and win that case for investment in education, not in a competitive way, but in a emphatic, effective way. And then I think third, as Bidemi alluded to, we're interested in continuing to understand not only the impact of or the financial implications of all of this, but also the kind of cultural implications, like the culture of aid, the behavior, the changes. And this is, I guess, what some people are already calling the silver linings or the behaviors and dynamics that we can that might shift now in a faster way than they would have done previously before this year. So that's a set of questions we're interested to. I mean, at IFG, we're having a lot of conversations across the philanthropy world as to how to utilize the diversity of philanthropy's partners that range from everything from multilateral organizations to grassroots organizations. But if anyone else is also interested in that, we would love to, again, continue that conversation. So all of that to say that this kind of effort is, let's join up voice, let's be strategic about that case for education, and then let's work together on continuing to understand this and try and strategically think about positioning education going forward. That's really the spirit of this conversation today. We've got about 25 minutes or so for questions and thoughts on that. What next? Maybe let's take the first few questions if you've got them. Some of you are putting them in the chat already, but let's take the first few questions on clarifications, particularly to Elena on the USAID data, but also to Bidemi and the number of other analyses that she's uncovering. Elena, do you want to say anything else about TVET? I know Fabian's put in a question in the chat about the specific impact on TVET, and asks a little bit about, can you give a little bit more data on just the sort of programs that USAID was funding?
Yes, absolutely. So TVET, it's a little bit of a complex situation with our youth programming, because up until 2018, youth programs could not be funded out of education money. So it was funded out of other types of money, because the money within USAID were frequently earmarked for specific types of sectoral work, right? So USAID, in that way, was able to target its resources to achieving specific outcomes, but also the negative side of it was that sometimes it limited our ability to do work that we knew needed to be done, but we did not have a dedicated funding stream. So a lot of youth and workforce development work was actually in that bucket and was implemented largely through cross-sectoral efforts. So a lot of programs were funded out of multiple pots of money. That's why, it's a little harder to track, but on the upside, it was frequently very effective, because it would be like, say, targeting young people who were disadvantaged, who did not have not an education, not in training, did not have any foundational skills, and the programs would provide them access to the foundational skills, to the livelihoods, to basic understanding of family planning, for example, right? Contraception, things like that, HIV prevention, and all in like a one neat package. So if you think about it, it's super cross-sectoral and it's really, really hard to track. So with a workforce development, a lot of that work was in that sort of multi-sectoral flavor. We did have a dedicated, in many countries, we had dedicated work specifically to strengthen TVET systems as part of like a broader strategic approach to strengthening the education in the country overall. But again, that would be, I have a full chapter on this in the report, and it provides a lot of examples. But I think that I don't want to promise you more than I delivered in the report. Again, it's all limited to the data that I had available at the time, which only one source was really left. So I hope I gave you enough of a kind of a interest to look at the report closely tomorrow.
Thanks, Elena. Does anybody else have any clarification questions on any of the data that was presented today? Either pop them in the chat or feel free to put your hand on and come on camera.
Her hand up, Maria Vittoria.
Go on, Maria.
I don't know if you can see.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It's very timely. Maybe I missed that, but one thing that I would consider very useful is to see what are the strengths of those who want to step in or who are already in and want to coordinate. And this can start now. I mean, because given the size of the US funding and the range, it might be not possible maybe to cover everything. So we have to go by priorities, see what is most demanded by the countries. This, I think, it's a very important element. and see where we are better at, because that's where we should start from. Not trying to reach out everywhere, everything, but rather to see where we can combine our strengths in order to start in a most efficient way. I don't know if this.
Oh, come back on mute. You've just slipped on mute.
Sorry. I don't know whether this is already foreseen in any future report, but I think this is something that we can start, and it's not very difficult to do in the end, no? And then see where we can start combining at best our strengths. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria Vittoria. I think that question is exactly what prompted these two pieces of work, and no doubt some of the others that Bidemi's referenced to, is this recognition that no one actor, nor indeed sector of actors, people turn to, there's a lot of talk about turning to philanthropy to fill the gaps of the reduced aid. Financially, that is not going to happen. And so the question is, well, what do we do? And how do we make sure that the investments are as effective? That's a conversation that's been happening over the last few years. How do we improve the effectiveness of every dollar spent? We're far from achieving that. And that's really what we're turning to everyone here. This is a gathering in particular of those involved in the global kind of architecture and global coordination of education. How do we both improve the effectiveness of what is being spent and continue to make a bigger advocacy case for education? I think that's my of my kind of top three concerns, that fact that we are not winning that case for investment, and that those now likely to make decisions on what gets continued in a lot of the other aid agencies that we don't have data on, because a lot of the European agencies it's forecast cuts rather than immediate cuts. I think there is a question of how much we come together in joint advocacy. So far, I think we see, even if you look as a sort of anecdotal cut across media, national print in various countries in Africa and Asia, and indeed in some high-income countries, you see cases being made for health, ECD, humanitarian aid, all of which are, of course, incredibly important. We are not yet seeing that wave of voice for education. And how do we do that? How do we put that effort into the advocacy for education, I think, is an open question we have for everyone here. Elena or Bidemi, did you want to jump in and add anything?
I just wanted to add maybe one thing. I remember having that conversation some years ago when Education Cannot Wait was being created, right? And that's exactly the case that I think some folks were able to make very successfully to the global community, saying that education indeed cannot wait until all the other things, humanitarian crisis are addressed, that we do need to invest immediately. We do need to provide those services at the time of crisis and whatever is happening. So I think in a way, this sort of similar lines of reasoning can be revisited now, because I agree with you. I also do not see any references to education, even in the continuous post-USAID plans.
And then
Yeah,
go on.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I think I agree. I think the advocacy piece is quite important, not just to the global community, but also with African governments themselves, because they're the ones that really are going to fund the bulk of this and trying to sort of focus their attention, especially in the areas where we know are the most critical for improving sort of learning outcomes would be really important as well.
And again, if anyone on the call has any knowledge of analysis that's happening at country level in particular on learning loss, on organizations that are closing or opening, we are hearing of the occasional sort of, due to some of the staffing cuts, new organizations being set up. We want to continue to kind of watch and understand these dynamics as to what are the changing priorities. Elena, do you want to come in? There's a question in the chat about higher education, which will be detailed in the report that's released tomorrow. But there's another couple of questions for you too, including one on your suggestions, your recommendations for next steps? Go on, jump in.
Well, I think the most critical piece is at the country level, where USAID, and I've worked closely with our missions, frequently led the work around coordination, donor coordination around education sector plans. And I mean, again, it's not TVET, it's basic education, but in basic education space, again, most of USAID investment went to that space, and USAID's role was really critical. And in particular, in making sure that those voices who are typically not heard were actually heard, like voices of groups of parents of children with disabilities, for example. That was really high priority for USAID over the past few years. And in many countries, it's due to USAID's work that we actually saw some reforms in that space, or really trying to support community level schools that were totally underfunded and not on the maps at all before USAID's involvement. So I think that marginalized and vulnerable populations component, and the component around continued coordination with the ESP planning, because in many countries, USAID funded very particular piece of work, like say teacher support, material development, and so on, while other donors funded other pieces. So with USAID's withdrawal, who's going to pick it up? Somebody has to, because otherwise ESP will be implemented in this way, but not that way. So who's going to lead that work? That is my biggest question. And I think that everybody who ever worked in the field knows that fragmentation of aid is a big issue. So as we face this reality of reduced funding, addressing this fragmentation through improved collaboration is really key. But we also know collaboration is not cheap. It's also expensive. So that is also a question, right?
It is. But let's, at the very basis of it is sharing of information. And that's what we're calling for here today, and we'll continue to call for publicly, I think. Emily, you've got a question. Jump in.
Yeah, so just to say thank you so much to Elena, and it's so lovely to see you on this call. And also to Bidemi for your reflections as well. Obviously, at the FCDO, we're also kind of looking into this, the impact at the country level, and just picking on what Elena was saying there in terms of the country level, like understanding what's actually happening at the country level. I think it might be useful for the future research to maybe focus on like a small set of case study countries where we can actually really look at how the impact is, actually materializing. We have countries where, there was such tight coordination and close kind of effort around a reform, particularly foundational learning reform, to the extent that, we knew what USA was going to fund and the UK was going to fund another bit and the bank was going to fund another bit, all kind of part of our global coalition for foundational learning, where we really have tightened up our efforts. So certainly, I think it would be really useful to focus in on a couple of countries where it's really quite obvious now where the gaps are going to be materializing. And I really did appreciate the recommendations that you're making around coordination, around diversifying the funding base. But I do really like this idea of what do we need to do differently? Like what is the pivot that we need to now make in terms of how we work with local partners, how we work with national partners, because the sort of these cliff edges that partners are experiencing right now, just so dramatic and so devastating for so many partners who've built up brilliant expertise. And I think that is something that we really need to try and identify, is like, what is the different way of working that we can ensure that partners are not in a situation where they are dependent entirely on one source of funding, but they have that much more diverse range of funding. I was just going to offer, because I have to go to another meeting now at the top of the hour, but just to say I'm really looking forward to reading the report, which I hope you'll circulate tomorrow, and very much open and ready to continue to collaborate and have this discussion going forward. Obviously, you're aware that the UK has also signalled its intention to reduce ODA, and that will happen over the next couple of years. And I think, in a way, like, that's why we have a bit more time now to actually really think strategically, what does this mean in terms of how we make the case for education, how, governments who are so focused on trying to deliver these reforms, how we can kind of come behind them and support them in these long-term partnerships. So I'm kind of keen to continue to have that engagement with you guys going forward. And I apologize for leaving the meeting early, but really grateful that I was able to listen in. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Emily.
Thanks, Emily. I think that country point is really important. I think there's sort of two buckets, and I think already we're seeing some conversation around, for example, Malawi and Kenya, where there is really strong and was really strong coordination across bilateral, multilateral, and other funder organizations. And so the more we can continue to share, because I mean, again, the INEE Civicus surveys are reaching organizations in those countries. So the more we can pull that together using existing mechanisms and so forth at the leg, I think fantastic. But Emi's also got this great idea of looking at countries that have had either sudden aid drops like Rwanda, or have worked for a while without the level of aid dependency like India or South Africa, or some of the ones in the sort of in ETF's landscape. I think that would be also really useful to kind of pull out some of the, what is the diversification? What does it look like? What did it take? And what are the implications in terms of the local ecosystems? Because it's not going to be as easy as localization, great stuff in some of these contexts. So thank you. Any other questions, particularly looking ahead, and sort of what is it that we can and should do differently? Elena, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, let me jump in to answer also Keith's question now that I actually read it up in terms of research. One of the interesting things, and I think it speaks a bit to what Emily also was just saying for me, is to see the impact of USAID's withdrawal on also local capacities and local partners. USAID over the past number of years focused very strongly on strengthening local capacity, local NGOs, building a cadre of local expertise in supporting education reform. So I'm fearing that now that its expertise base will become somewhat unmoored, right? And how can we best leverage that local expertise to ensure that, again, that local work continues and local education reform continues being fully, supported by local expertise. And I think it's really important, and I know that many other donors share that appreciation for the importance of local expertise. So that's one of the research areas that I think would be important to look at.
Yeah, and one I think not many are looking at specifically at the moment. Does anyone else have any questions or information about work that you're doing or have heard of that we've not picked up on today?
Maybe I would have a question before we engage in. Oh, Maura, it's more important. Maura, please go ahead.
There we are. Sorry, I don't know about more important. But I did just want to say to reiterate thanks that everyone has said for the presentations, but also, Elena, on your last point, that local expertise is something that we very much actively work on at NORAG. If you do have networks who are feeling unmoored, please do encourage them to join our South Also Knows network, because that's a place where they can be in contact with each other, as well as visible to the international community that might be looking for an expert on Ghana, from Ghana, who would actually be able to support them much better than maybe somebody else would. So that's just a very practical small thing that to demonstrate the support for exactly what Elena's talking about there. Thank you.
Thank you, Moira.
Hugo, back to you.
Yeah, no, I had a question about the evidence, because we know that USAID was also building a lot of evidence, not only the data that we have, but also methodologies, approaches. So maybe there are a few things that you want to remind us of, because here again, there will be some kind of gap, and both at international level, the reflection that we have on what needs to be done, but also at local level, because all these methods had implications and were really reliable ones in the different countries to have the right data that very often did not exist. So I just wanted to see if you wanted to share a little bit more on that. And also maybe not only on what has been good, but what was in preparation maybe that we should think about, because here again, the gaps are not going to be completely filled, but we can, as Maria Vittoria said, and you also explained, begin to think strategically about what to do first.
You asking such a wonderful question. I wish we had another hour for that. Because honestly, this is one of the things that I think perhaps at this moment most heartbreaking is the amount of knowledge that has been removed from the web. And I know there are a lot of efforts to bring this knowledge back. But yes, I mean, USAID has developed and piloted a lot of really, really useful toolkits and guide notes and systematic reviews of different literature. For example, I've collaborated before, January 20th, I collaborated very closely with our Office of the Chief Economist, with Dean Carlin's group, to produce an updated evidence specifically for the foundational skills, updated compared to the JEEP report, but in more kind of a practical kind of application in relation to USAID's work. So that work was almost done. And we're just trying to figure out if there's any way we can still publish it, because it was really, I thought, was designed to be very useful for partner governments, for other donors. Another piece that actually is finally being released is Applied Education System Diagnostic Toolkit that Laura and Emily and I were all working since 2018 on. And that work is completed and hopefully will be in public domain in the next few days. So at least something. But yes, maybe this is an idea for another webinar for you, is to have like an overview of resources that USAID had in education space. We can do it as an implementation versus research space, and showcase this work that others can now pick up, because a lot of these products, honestly, also looking for home. We all have them downloaded on our computers, but they're no longer available in the public domain. So it would be nice to have somebody volunteer to publish these on their websites.
Thanks.
In a way, Elena, I think there's almost three there, right? There's one that is the cost effectiveness work that so few others do. And again, coming back to Maria's point earlier, we're going to need that more than ever now, and too few still collect cost data. There's another one on how do you understand a country's priorities and as a different funder, because if we are turning to different funders, then we're looking at a lot of funders who haven't necessarily been a part of this formal architecture with the local education group and so forth. So what is it you need to do to understand where a country is at, what the country priorities are, and the many competing ones, hence the system diagnostic. Perhaps there's 2 or 3 conversations that could come out of this, and including perhaps some on the kind of how to get to that country level of analysis.
Yeah, absolutely. And on this point also, complementary to what you did, Elena, which was really the big picture, but also going in detail of some very interesting data. Internally at ETF, we also try to see very pragmatically in the countries that we work with, what would be the direct, I would say, stakeholders and policy implication. Some not aggregating data, but in each of the countries. So really almost the political economy of this activity in countries and what it shapes. Because I think what is important is that all of our work also in the community, international community, and USAID also very specifically, is not things that we just, activities that fill a gap. But I think what we try to do, all of us, is to have leverage activities. So activities that not only leads to a result, but leads to the best possible results in the system, to have a chain effect, so to say, in the system. And that's also a very key element, I think, that we need to think of.
I think the idea of a shared resource place. Thanks, Bidemi, for putting the RTI link in. That's a really useful thing, as about accumulating resources in one place. and trying to join up the messages on what we know works, what we know doesn't. We're going to need to know that, and what we're all curious about in order to direct any further research investments from others going forward.
Yeah.
We're almost coming to the end. Hugues, shall I turn back over to you with that thought of what conversations come next?
Yeah.
And thank you everyone for your discussions today.
And please, Laura, jump in too. I think, you know, what I said at the beginning, and it was the idea that we had, all of us, Laura, Bidemi, and of course, Elena, was to engage a conversation on this topic. We know that many others, and Bidemi, you reminded us of it, are working on that, because definitely the shift is important. So we need to have continuous discussions, probably on countries. There are countries where we can have discussions with local education groups, probably also on evidence, as you suggested, on what also we do next. But I heard really two things that I would like to finish with, one from you, Elena, which is not only will there be a funding gap, 80 billion overall, not for education, but overall. And of course, we know that many other sectors also play a very important role in education, for education. But there will be also, what you said, an advocacy and evidence gap. And I think it is very important to see that. So how do we work together on these different aspects? I remember some years ago, we said, I don't have the data, but in education, ODA at large, we spend only 3% on evidence and knowledge, whereas in health, they spend at that time 21%. So of course, it will be very difficult to increase this knowledge base now and the funding for that, because we have less funding at international level. But this is probably something which is related to the question that you raised, Laura. You know, what do we have to do differently? Which is also probably one of the questions raised by this withdrawal, which has so many implications. So evidence gap, but the advocacy gap also is really important, especially also if we consider the huge soft power that the US, I don't know how I should say that, have or had in this regard. So it is important. The second thing, Bidemi, is what you say, and we began to touch on. You said we don't hear the voice of local actors, local ministries, local actors, not only those who are impacted, because maybe, you know, some NGOs, very small NGOs or implementers, will just have to close the doors, but also what they suggest. So harmonization, everybody is part of this harmonization of our work. And we had this discussion earlier before the webinar, but technically we should also broaden our conversation to all the stakeholders, to the countries that we work with, and hear their voices too. I think it's now it's a first conversation, but we need to broaden that. So these two elements will be key. I will leave it to you to say a few things, Laura, but I think we need to continue the discussion, maybe in different, more specific webinars. Maybe also I would say that all the community and here the EU and ETF, but all the rest of us maybe have to meet physically at some point with all these reports that are going on and all the idea that just emerged of 1 hour of conversation. It could be interesting to see who would like to organize and host that, but probably something interesting to do.
Thanks, Hugues. I've got nothing really to add except a renewed plea to everybody here of any that you get in touch, either with any reflections from today or with any knowledge you have or hear about over the coming weeks and months of the analysis of the implications of these cuts for education and of particular conversations you think we need to have. Because I think this is going to be a conversation that will end up in various different subparts, whether specifically on evidence or specifically on different countries, specifically on advocacy, how we come together as a community of education actors at particular events. There's one sub-conversation, for example, at the moment on going to the Financing for Development conference in Seville this summer. So please do reach out in response. You'll get the report and so forth tomorrow. So do come back to us and keep nourishing this conversation. And we look forward to seeing you again and continuing it. Thank you in particular, I should say, to UG, not only for organizing this, but for commissioning this piece of research. As Bidemi said, this analysis that Elena has done is the first and most deepest analysis of the implications for education in particular. A lot of the other stuff out there is either of that leaked data set on the USAID programs that had been cut, or of the IATI data. So this is the sort of detailed stuff that we can then use to dig deeper and deeper and strategically plan forward. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to you, Laura, and your network. Thank you to Bidemi, and big thanks, of course, to Elena for this report. It's online tomorrow, so please read it and come back to us.
Thank you,
Thanks
everybody.
a lot.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
We'll talk soon.
We'll talk soon. Take care.
Ciao, ciao.